it's going to take a while. Why don't you stay a little longer and see how it works, and maybe you won't be disappointed. And when that happens, the majority of people persist with the counseling process. So sometimes disappointment is a result of not having given it enough time. But at the other extreme, there is somebody who's had one session and says, I'm disappointed. And I trust that person's intuition. And you might find that surprising, that if somebody has done it 3 or 4 times and then persists, and somebody who's done it once and says, I'm disappointed, I say, why? So I don't feel comfortable. And my answer invariably to somebody like that is change your counselor. Because the impact of counseling is predicated on the degree of comfort and trust you have with the counselor. And that's not something on which you can put a numeric, although people have tried, or quantify. And then I think it's intuition, it's your ability to relate to somebody, and for lack of a better word, if I may use a cliche, it's the chemistry. And if that doesn't happen the first time, then I think it's fair enough to talk to somebody else. And when I've done that, typically on the second or third attempt, the person will come back and say, now I found the right counselor. So when it starts that way, I think you agree with me, Asta, when it begins that way, it's more likely to result in something tangible rather than disappointment. I hope I've answered that.
Yeah, please. Absolutely.
Dr. Parekh, actually this question is directed to you because I get asked a lot, people for some reason mistake me to be a mental health practitioner. So I receive a lot of messages from people who actively are looking for help, but they're so intimidated by the words that they don't know, do I have to first go to a psychiatrist or a counselor or a life coach or a neuro coach? It's become a very complicated space. So on behalf of maybe the audience, where does someone begin?
You're right, but to an extent, Asta, and that's a paradox of it. It has become a complicated space, but has also become an enormously simplified space. And that's thanks to people like you, thanks to Isha, thanks to some other people I see Vedika Bodar, who does podcasts in mental health. So thanks to the efforts of a lot of people, the media who's present over here, it's also becoming very simplified. And during the pandemic, because of the conditions imposed by the pandemic on us, isolation, etc., there was an enormous growth in the need for mental health. And that's something you would have expected. But what really surprised me, and maybe that's your generation, is how open it became. People would openly write, and you probably see it a lot more than I do. I'm not very much on social media, but people write about what they're going through. They make recommendations. I started getting reviews, a whole lot of reviews. Those Google reviews, at one point there were over 500, and then Google cut them down, I don't know why, so they're still around 450. And I turned to my children and I said, I'm now like a restaurant. But I get patients who come to me, and I'm always curious, why have they come to me? Some of them don't need to see me. As you said, they need to go to a counselor, and so I read your Google review. So, there has been a paradigm shift, or a generational shift, if I may call it that, in the openness, in the approach to mental health, in accepting that illness is not a sign of weakness, that there is no shame, there is no stigma. And I think the brave people, amongst whom I count Isha, I count all of you over here, Anu, Zuni, the whole family, they talk about this. And you're spearheading this campaign. And I'm old enough to have seen the advent of feminism. I'm old enough to see what happened with the gay movement, in San Francisco and other places in the 70s and 80s. And they were always leaders who put themselves on the line. They're like the COVID workers, like some of us frontline workers in COVID. We took risks. We went out there, we did our job. And I think there are people who are doing that in mental health. So yes, a little complex. But, given the choice between keeping it under wraps and not talking about it, and on the other extreme, the other end of the spectrum, having a plethora of choices to the point it becomes complex, I hope you agree with me that the second is preferable to the first.
Vidhu sir, how difficult was it to get Isha to persevere with this? One of the things that Dr. did mention, that you need to stay the course, and did you ever, in the course of these 10 years, feel like Isha is on the verge of giving up, or, you were sort of stressed about that? And a family has to play that important role. So what was your role in making, did Isha think of giving up? मेरे से तो नहीं होगा, I'm doomed to be this way, and to the extent that she recovered enough to be able to write about it. So what was it like driving her to stay the course, to persevere?
See, my job was primarily to take her stress on. And I think that should be the first thing that a caretaker or family should do. It's like, I hate the comparison, but these days, since I'm writing a fantasy, I have to say, because this image came to my mind, that when Shiva did the Sagar Manthan, among other things there was poison that he held back. I think that the job of the family is to take that poison, the darkness, out of the mind of the family member who's suffering, and really hold it, literally, to himself, and bear with it. So whatever Isha has done, Isha has done. But yes, over so many years, I have tried my best, and everybody with me has tried our best to take her stress and take it away, as much as possible take it away from her. That's the only thing we can do as a family.
Asta, now one of the things that of course talk about this friend of yours, and how he did the care that he should have, that could have prevented the tragedy, and one of the things that Isha does mention in a great detail is, the role of the caregiver, and how for the person suffering, that particular episode might go from memory the moment you have had that episode, doesn't remember, but for the caregiver it's always a continued stress, or a continued sort of thing that he or she goes. So if you could just talk about your experience with this friend, and what have you seen about the family being coming together for or not being able to come together, if you just could talk about it.
So I've actually seen two extremes, which is either the family is extremely supportive. My parents have been extremely supportive, they're here today as well. There have been times where I have wanted to give up on the process, and they have said, no, maybe it's this person that's not working out, don't leave the process. In the case of this friend of mine, as Dr. Parekh said, our generation is actually very proactively looking to take charge of mental and emotional wellness, to learn to do the work that is required to kind of build your mental resilience and strength. Unfortunately, in the case of this boy, he tried very, very hard to convince his parents, and kind of there was a point at which the counselor said, I need to see your parents. You are now showing signs of suicidal behavior. And the first thing that the boy told the counselor, sir, my parents will not come. They don't believe there is anything wrong with me. And the counselor said, but you have been clinically evaluated, and this is based on an assessment that has been done on your mental state of being. Call them, I will speak to them. And he said, sir, nothing will work. His parents were unaware of the fact that he was going for therapy.
Were you as friends, I would count friends among the caregivers, a sort of extended circle of friends, close friends. Were you aware of this boy's condition?
Yes.
And did you
we tried to speak
with a family?
Yes. And it was a shocker to me, because in that, at least you would think that in this educated strata of society, business, family, you've sent the kid abroad to study, and your child is literally giving you a cry for help and saying, I'm doing my bit, now I need you to hold my hand. And I don't know sometimes if people genuinely don't understand mental wellness, because I've seen that side as well, where I've had friends who say, but how can you be so sad that you want to take your own life? I just don't understand it. So there's genuinely sometimes an inability to grasp how can sadness become so extreme that a person wants to believe that no longer being alive itself is better than being alive. And unfortunately, in the case of this boy, also I want to say there's a reason when we're talking about depression specifically that it's called the invisible illness. So this boy, his parents would see him otherwise behaving normal, going to college, going out to party once in a while. So that thing was like, you're just doing natak. This is all in your head. That was the mentality. And then he took his own life. So what a tragedy that the child was willing to take help, but I mean, I just want to stress on that's where the support system comes in. There have been so many times where he would have a mental breakdown and just by us friends being around him and giving him an ear and saying, what are you going through? Talk about it. You want to cry, cry. He would instantly feel better. So whether that support system comes in the form of your friends accepting you and not judging you, your family, though ideally your family should really have your back in such situations. I think Isha is blessed that she's had the support, and even I consider myself extremely blessed to have supportive parents. I cannot stress the importance of having family support enough.
Doctor, taking on from there, one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this narrative is to actually have Isha say that, take to hospitalization, take to rehabilitation because in ways it helps the family. There's a guilt that the patient has. I have seen that, through my own experiences. You just start blaming yourself. Okay, you are inflicting this on the family, so it's maybe better you move out into. So how does a counselor help the patient, help the person deal with this sort of guilt, which is sort of a person saying, okay, I can't inflict this on people I love.
As I mentioned to you, Shantanu, by way of disclosure, I'm not a counselor, but what I would imagine a counselor would do is understand that this is not imaginary guilt. There is something real in this. A person who is depressed is, anyway, by nature of that depression, looking at the world through guilt, looking at the world through self-blame, through loss of self-esteem, and certainly it puts a burden on the caregivers. It puts a burden on the family. It's not easy. It's relatively easy for us, ensconced in our consulting rooms, in our clinics, to talk to them for a few minutes, to sometimes give a one-size-fits-all kind of advice. But to the family that is dealing with somebody who's troubled, it is an enormous challenge. And sometimes depression heightens your sensitivity to the pain of other people. You're going through pain yourself, so you can also understand a little better what people are going through. And so they want to be in a hospital or in a clinic where they don't want their family to experience that kind of burden. So there may be a certain legitimacy to that request. How does the person, the counselor, deal with that? I think it would depend on person to person. In certain cases, I would imagine the counselor would think that that's an appropriate thing to do, because you're now complicating, in a kind of a vicious cycle, somebody's grief, depression and guilt. The person feels guilty about what's happening to the family, becomes more depressed, becomes more guilty, and one feeds the other. And I would think a counselor would advise. Most counselors would not, because they would want to take the onus for that decision. So they would then say, talk to your doctor. The doctor might be in a better position. And then the second aspect of that is, what are you going to do in the hospital or in the clinic? It's not just a question of putting somebody away so that they're not a burden on the family. And sometimes there are things you can do in a clinic which are not possible at home. For example, enhance is not a right word, increase the dosage in a way that you wouldn't do at home because of the possibility of side effects. In a clinic or a hospital, that's monitored. The nurses will come and take the blood pressure, check on the person. So you may accelerate that process of medication. So there may be other aspects to the need to be in a hospital. And finally, it's a safe place, usually. These days it's not a safe place for doctors. Think of what happened in Kolkata and all that. But so there is a certain element of safety. The kind of thing that you mentioned, Asta, I would assume that person had been in a hospital or clinic. The suicide would have been improbable. So sometimes a person needs to be there. The rationale might be different. It may stem from not wanting to be a burden on the family, but it might also mean you accelerate the treatment and put the person in a safe, comfortable space. So it's kind of, to use the word people like it, it's complication.
Doctor, one of the things that people reading this book will find out is the importance of art and creativity in addressing issues of mental health, and been sort of very privileged to have Isha send us paintings that she has done during this period, and really startling the use of colors here. And actually Vidhu asked us to use one of this in the back cover too, and so it's one of Isha's paintings. And so Dr. Parekh, and also after Dr. Parekh answers, Asta, how does art and creativity help, and in this? And a related question, do creative people tend to have more of this? There are quite a few, and in fact, at one point of time, Isha sent me a list of creative people with bipolar disorders, and we were tempted to carry that list in the book. Of course, we did. But if you could come on that, and we discussed this, and we work on a certain visual for this also.
Exactly, that's what I was about to begin with. I anticipated this question, and so I'm kind of prepared for it. But I don't think it's fair to everybody that I should monopolize this discussion, especially when I'm in the presence of two remarkably creative people. And so I think, if you don't mind, I'm not kind of sabotaging the authority, but maybe Vinod could talk about it. I mean, he started by saying that he wanted the painting up, so maybe he could talk about the creativity aspect. I'd love to hear what Asta has to say about it, and then I'll bore you a little with my ready-made answer, pre-manufactured, fabricated answer.
So, sir, if you could comment on how you've seen Isha address, what kind of encouragement did you think you gave to get her to engage in creative aspects? She's a Kathak dancer. She's gone into Spanish, Latin American dance, and all of that. So, if you could just talk about how that is.
See, all I'm saying, all that is her doing. I didn't ask her to do anything. Of course, when she was in Pune, she had a great guru there, so it was great for me to go and see her dance. I've been there many times. But I think what I realized when I saw her going through her mental condition is that art really helps her. When you're painting, see what happens, the noise that people hear in their head, and all of us hear that noise, I think that noise for a while quietens or shuts down when you're painting, or when you're dancing, or when you're... So what happens when you're creating that art as an artist, you're so involved in that art that actually your mind for a while shuts off all distractions. This is my analysis, it may be wrong, but this is what I feel works.
Asta, how did you what kind of creative pursuits you engaged in?
To me, writing and journaling was very therapeutic, and I believe a lot in mind-body connection. There are these documentaries where they show pent-up energy and people releasing it and doing these bizarre dances and things like that to just let the energy out of the body. And there's something very therapeutic about releasing pent-up emotions. And for me, that was writing. I journal a lot. If there's something good, if there's something bad, if there's something ugly, I think there's just something about releasing it from the body that is very therapeutic. It could be painting, It could be dancing, the way Isha has been, using that as her pillars to deal with her various setbacks that she was having. For me, it could be writing, but I've always known that art, which is very, very instrumental in, and now I think doctor could help in there's this word for it, right and left brain coherence, where the active mind and the analytical mind and the logical mind is forced, as Vidhuji said, to be quiet, and the creative brain takes over, which gives you some sense of the brain calming down. I think Dr. Parekh can now give his rehearsed, technical, academic answer.
Do not provoke me. You might regret it. You might regret it. So let's leave the left brain, right brain stuff out for a moment, because that will stimulate me to go in another direction, perhaps not the one that you wanted. So of course I validate. I mean, I'm nobody to validate. Data, research data validates everything that the two of you have said so far. That it is a channel, the energy goes, all of that. But there's also an interesting aspect which you raise, which is the other relationship. And that is, are bipolar people necessarily more creative? Is there a link between creativity and bipolar mood disorder? Indeed there is. And that too is supported by very compelling data. A lot of research studies, I'm not going to lapse into that, but for those of you interested, I might just put in a word or two and you can look it up yourself. There's an incredible writer called Kay Jamison. She suffered from bipolar mood disorder. It must have been sometime in the 70s. She researched it. She got fascinated by it. So decided to go to medical school and become a psychiatrist. Wow. She became a psychiatrist. She did brilliantly in her career. And she became a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore, where I trained for 4 years. And she wrote about it. So she's done the whole thing. Okay. She's gone through the illness, she has researched it, she has gone through medical school, she has gone through a psychiatry residency, which can be taxing sometimes. She's become a professor and she's written a book. And that book I would recommend to people. It's fascinating. It's called Touched by Fire, like Prometheus. Touched by Fire, Manic Depressive Illness and Creativity. And I'd rather you read the book than I try to paraphrase it. It's incredible. There is a psychiatrist called Nancy Anderson. She's one of the most well-known psychiatrists in the world. At some point, people thought she might get the Nobel Prize. She certainly got the Science Medal from the US President. She and I are friends, and we were also colleagues on an editorial board of the European Journal of Neurosciences for 2 decades, for 20 years. And Nancy has done incredible research again on not only on creativity and bipolar disorder, but creativity and schizophrenia, and she's taken it a step further. She has done brain scans on first-degree relatives of people who have these illnesses. So somebody with bipolar disorder, of course you study that person, but you study a first-degree relative, brother, sister, parent, and she showed also a high degree of changes in the brain in first-degree relatives, and also high degree of prevalence. So there is a genetic element. But now to get to my ideas, now that we've done it, I think I have to show off a little.
Yes.
Alright, you know what I did to make it quick? I requested Shantanu, and I think Shantanu outsourced it to Anuja. Or did you do it yourself? You did it yourself. You did all the labor, but Anuja, I think, got it ready. And we will have it on. Just to make a moment, Anuja, then we'll just get it on. So, to illustrate this link between creativity and bipolar mood disorder, there's a huge number of writers, painters, musicians, Schumann for example, who have been diagnosed with bipolar mood disorder, and their work has reflected the illness and the diagnosis. I thought rather than talk about a bunch of them, it's better to illustrate one or two. So we want to begin with Picasso, and as many of you would know, Picasso had his blue period and his pink period, or the rosy period, something like that. Let's call it pink and blue. And during the blue period, he went through intense bouts of depression, self-doubt, and that was between 1901 and 1904, 3 years. And during that time, his paintings were full of pain, full of agony, and they were actually painted mostly in blue. You see, I feel blue. And then he swung into a period of mania where he became prolific of paintings all depicting happiness, clowns, harlequins as they were called, and of course they were all in rows. So it's a very stark kind of contrast between the work he did in those first 3 years when he went through depression and what he did in the next 3 years when he went into his pink period. I'll just illustrate one painting of each and then just show you a whole lot of other images. Maybe we should just move down and yeah, let me have the mic and I'll just stand here. Alright, Anuja. Okay, if you could pause for a minute, just half a minute. So that's the harlequins. Okay, it's kind of a happy theme. Somebody who's clowning around makes people happy. And I think it's a classic painting of that pink period. And then this will follow by a whole bunch of images. We don't have to talk about them. Yes. Yes, if you could pause here. This is the first painting of the blue period, painted in 1901. Picasso must have been about 21, I think, maybe 22, when he made this painting. And it's called Evocation, and sometimes people call it the burial of Cassegos. That's kind of subtitle for this painting.
It was his friend, wasn't he? The burial of his friend, wasn't he?
They were very close friends. He was a year older than Picasso, so I think they met when Picasso was either 18 or 19, and Cassegos was a year older than him. They met in Barcelona. Cassegos was the son of the US Consul General. So he was American in Barcelona, but he was also a poet, writer, and some people think he would have blossomed into a great painter in his own right. But for whatever reason, these two suddenly became very, very close friends. They hung out together, they traveled together. They went to Paris together, I think in 1900 for the World's Fair. And there in Paris, Cassegos met a lovely young French woman, Germaine, I think Germaine was her name. And he fell madly in love with her. She rejected him. Picasso went back to Barcelona. He hung around. He didn't go back with Picasso. He stayed back for Germany. He tried to persuade her, and she just repulsed him. And then he tried to kill her actually. And when that didn't work, he took his own life. So at 21, he killed himself. Picasso was now in Barcelona and got so profoundly affected by it. He went into withdrawal, he became depressed, and he made this painting. So that's his body lying over there. There are the people around him, bodies right down. And that was the first of it. So also to illustrate, sometimes these manic phases or depressive phases have a trigger which sets it off. This was the trigger. And then for the next 3 years, they were all sad paintings that he made. And I think there's just a quick list of them. Okay, so you can pause here. So, 3 years of the pink period, almost instantaneously triggered by this death, followed by the blue period. But I thought closer to home. And, this is especially for you, Vinod. Now I have to let this out. I'm family, okay? We will talk about it. Our friend Vinod gets offended if you compare him to any other director. Compare him to Spielberg, which most people would take as a compliment, but Vinod won't like it at all. But I think the one person he wouldn't mind being compared to, and he should be compared to, is Gurudutt. And Gurudutt is a great hero for Vinod and to some extent for me. And Gurudutt also had bipolar disorder, and as we would know, he tragically took his own life for reasons that we need to get into. But Gurudutt, during his manic period, made films which were full of fun. And some of you may have seen them. I've seen all of his films, so almost all of them. And so there were Bar, a whole lot of films which were happy. And then in his depressive period, there was Pyasa, there was Kagas Ke Phool. And just an illustration of the difference, how the illness affected his creativity. So we can let that go.
मोहब्बत कर लो जी भर लो आज किसने रोका है पर बड़े गजब की बात है इसमें भी धोखा है। जाने कहा मेरा जिगर गया जी, अभी अभी यही था किधर गया जी।
किसकी अदाओं पे मर गया जी, बड़ी बड़ी अखियों से डर गया जी।
Minus the illness, you'll kill people. I don't think you'll kill yourself. That's another story.
Just to, before we open this, a couple of things for our panelists here. Asa, for somebody in this generation, one of the things that we come across is this is a very, very hyperactive on the social media kind of generation, you know, and that itself is a contributing factor to a lot of the issues that we face. Would you, as part of this generation, would you like to talk about that, and what are the kind of pitfalls of being continuously scrolling and being on social media?
Well, first of all, I think as part of
And
the...
also just to, you know, one of the things that I love about your podcast is the title you've chosen, Slow Down. You know, like, I think it's the very antithesis of what we are on social media, forever on a highway to nowhere. You know, so if you could talk about how that slowdown came and how it's all impacting us, this hyperactivity.
Well, I think social media in general has its pros and cons, though I do believe the cons far outweigh the pros. And never before has there been a time where you're just a scroll away from feeling like you're not pretty enough, successful enough, smart enough, rich enough. And that constant bombardment of information, like the overload on your senses, I think it's making us, one, constantly rely on external validation, which is something Isha has spoken about so much in the book. I'm talking about not even, let's keep it out of the way that, let's say a person is not even having any mental illness. It's become so difficult on a day-to-day basis to just be emotionally and mentally well. And social media, I would say, is the main culprit. One is because these apps are designed to be addictive. It's so easy to access. There's this sense of always wanting to know what everyone else is doing, but in the process of being in touch with what the world is doing, there's a very obvious sense of self-esteem that is lost. There's insecurities, there's body image issues. So it's easy to just feel like your life is the worst thing ever. When you're already in that mood, it is also difficult to remind yourself of the fact that everyone is putting the highlights of their life out there. No one is filming their mental breakdowns and putting it out there. So you're always seeing the highlights of other people's life and saying, damn, my life does not look like this. The second part, which a lot of mental health practitioners have taught me, which is more science-oriented for people who are curious to know, is in that 10 minutes of scrolling, you will see a post that makes you extremely happy, then something that disgusts you, then something that makes you a little envious. Your brain is not designed to feel 10 emotions in 5 minutes. So even what you're doing to the mind by exposing it to this unnecessary information is so detrimental to your mind on a daily basis, which is aggravated if you also have a mental health issue at the same time. There's a vicious circle where even Isha spoke about the fact that when you're going through something difficult, then you start doing things for external